Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Rabbi Dr. Simcha Feuerman, a clinical psychologist in private practice who specializes in high-conflict couples and families, as well as male sexual health. Simcha is also the creator of the Psychology of the Daf Yomi podcast and video series, in which he connects mindset and psyche with the daily teachings of the Talmud. Enjoy my conversation with Rabbi Dr. Simcha Feuerman. Simcha, thank you so much for joining me. I was really looking forward to this episode and speaking with you. Before we get into what you're involved with today and some of your really interesting mindsets and psychologies and so forth, why don't you start by telling us where you're from, all the sort of bits and pieces that led to where you are today.
Okay, I'm an American-born Orthodox Jewish person. I grew up in mostly in New York, although I was born, interestingly enough, in Atlanta, Georgia. My father, who's no longer in this world of blessed memory, was a Jewish educator for more than 60 years of his 80-something year-long life, and so as a family we were in different states. But since I was the youngest, I was mostly in New York, and being the son of a very well-educated rabbi and educator. He was both very well educated secularly as well as Jewishly. He exposed me to a lot of psychological and Torah ideas, pedagogically and otherwise. And in a certain sense, I started this psychology of the Daf, which we'll explain maybe a little later, almost as a homage to him, because of many conversations that we had and his firm conviction in so many ways in which he thought the ancient teachings of the rabbis offered a lot of wisdom psychologically, and he was particularly adept at it. And then I developed it further. It was almost like a bet to see, can every single page of the Talmud have one psychological insight? And that's sort of how this started, because it was after he passed away, and really during the most intense, lonely, difficult times at the beginning of Corona, where one didn't know, and especially if you're a therapist in private practice, you have no idea if anybody's walking in the door or not, or if they ever will again, especially the first 2 or 3 months. There was basically nothing to do. And one thing I was taught from my father is do something productive. So I said, let's just start banging away at the keyboard and see what comes out. And this is part of that. I am a psychotherapist. I've been a therapist for over 28 years. I work in Brooklyn and Queens, New York, and also in Boca Raton, Florida. And there are some people who from other states and countries who consult with me. And I'm also an ordained rabbi. And when I do therapy, I do therapy. I don't really, preach to people. That's not how therapy is practiced. If it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it has to be a duck. It has to quack like a duck and not quack like a quack. And therapists have to do therapy, not give nice, bubba and stories. Although rabbis do very good work, and they'll be counseling people long after the word psychology is forgotten and in the dust, just like they were counseling people long before the word psychology existed. But it's a different angle to approach a problem. And when people are coming for psychotherapy, they need a particular point. That doesn't preclude the fact that I think there's some wonderful insights into psychology and human nature from our ancient Jewish wisdom. And that was the goal of psychology of the Daf, which I can explain more if you want me to.
Yeah, so before we go into the psychology aspect of the Daf, why don't you just talk about what a Daf is for people that may not know?
Yeah, so the Talmud is the intellectual heart and soul of Judaism. It was composed, I believe, around from the years 100 to the years 400 or 500. Went through editorial process. It's very hard for people to even wrap their heads around, something that's a project that's many hundred years in the making, and that actually operates with incredible consistency in terms of certain chosen languages or phrases For example, there might be a phrase that occurs only 3 times in the entire 2,000 pages of the Talmud, and each time that phrase has a very particular nuance that can be mined and discovered. And there's many, many different things like that. It's an incredibly powerful document, and in Jewish life, in ancient Jewish life especially, the Jewish community, civil law and religious law were the same thing. Meaning to say, the Torah literally means the teachings of the way to go. That's the Torah. The Torah is how Jewish society, once upon a time, when they were operated more independently as a civilization, how they organized themselves socially, civically. So the Talmud discusses taxes, it discusses ethics, it discusses much of British common law. Comes from certain ideas that originated in the tracts in the Talmud that deal with torts and civil penalties and damages, but it also discusses medicine of the time. There are many astronomy. It really, Halley's Comet is mentioned. Now, I'd like to say the rabbis were brilliant, but part of psychology of the Daf was we try to do a little research. The Babylonians were great astronomers too. So in the Talmud, they knew Halley's Comet. Obviously, they didn't call it Halley's Comet because Halley didn't exist then, but they knew it. They talk about a shooting star that comes every 70 years. I think there's only one of them. You can imagine the perspective it takes to know something that happens every 70 years. But again, were the rabbis, did they discover this simultaneously with the Babylonians, or just to their credit, were they very well versed and up to date in the science of the times? You could draw your own conclusions. However, it is fascinating that Halley's Comet does appear, and many, many other fascinating things come up in the Talmud. So the Talmud is about 2,000 something pages, and about 150 years ago, a group of Orthodox Jews, who in general, in Orthodox Judaism, there's a tremendous emphasis on studying the Torah and studying the Jewish laws, whether it's the Bible or the text of the Talmud or the Mishnah, and there's other types of Jewish ethical literature, but it's considered a high imperative for everybody, even if you're not a rabbi, to study every day as much as you can of Torah, because after all, it's the word of God. So it's supposed to give you all kinds of ways to figure out how to live your life better and be a better person. And it's a very strong ethics among Orthodox Jews to study every day. You have Orthodox Jews who have professions, doctors, lawyers, police officers, and they still will study Talmud every day. And what happened was about 100 something years ago, a group of Jews organized this movement called the Daf Yomi, which is that every day they'll study one page of the Talmud. Now, it's intense. If you study it in the original, it's an ancient Aramaic. It's very difficult. There's no vowels. It's like looking at the old, Greek inscriptions. It's all consonants and the vowels are assumed, which means the grammar is very complex. And it takes a good hour to parse it out with the right commentaries. Today, there's been an explosion in Daf Yomi literature. So online, there's all kinds of text available in English and in other languages. There are people that give classes. They're even offbeat, non-religious, kind of irreverent, humorous Daf Yomi observations. My work always tries to be intellectually and psychologically honest and innovative, but I am respectful and have great deference for these ancient sages. So that's the Daf Yomi, and there's hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Jews every day doing Daf Yomi. When they finished the Daf Yomi cycle about 2.5 years ago, because it takes about 7.5 years of consistent study every day, day in, day out, to finish the entire Talmud. They gathered in a stadium, 50, 60,000 people who showed up, aside from all the people on video tuning in to make a celebratory end of the Talmud and then starting again. So did that answer the question? Or
Yeah, that was fantastic. I have to say, I'm curious to know, before we go into the psychology aspect, because I know you have a lot to say there, and I'd love to hear it. Like, what are some of the things that you feel most people don't get right about the Talmud, right? Like some misconceptions or some assumptions that, you feel either don't do the Talmud justice, or for whatever reason don't allow the Talmud to be what it really was designed to be, and what still it can be today.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think only because you asked, I wouldn't have thought of it, but I think that there are traditional Jews that mistake the Talmud in one way, and I think non-traditional Jews who are not observant, I think, also mistake the Talmud. Like people and personalities, we project onto them whatever it is that we want. It's not so easy to always see things as they really might be, and I'm not claiming either that I have the full picture, but I do wonder, and I think the mistake that I think religious people make might very well be in seeing the text as a religious text. And even though it is, the fascinating thing about law is that law, like any kind of discipline, operates according to certain foundational principles. And it doesn't matter whether it's Jewish or it's not Jewish. It might matter how you revere it. Like as an American, I have a certain degree of respect and reverence for the Constitution. As an Orthodox Jew, I have, I would say, even a higher degree of respect and reverence for the teachings of the Talmud and the Torah. But I have reverence for both. But the point is that you might relate to something differently if you see it as secular law versus religious law. But law operates under certain principles. And that's what's fascinating because, for example, there's something to understand about the philosophy of laws. And I'm a dilettante. I do happen to have a doctorate, but I don't really, I can't claim to have tremendous knowledge of every body and discipline. But from my understanding about the philosophy of law is that even though law tries to align itself with ethics, it is not ethics. There are going to be times where the law is going to be perceived as unethical by people, and there are going to be times where the reverse is so, that to do something ethical might be to go against the law. Think of a conscientious objector. And even in the Talmud, there's an idea that there's an individual who can do an act of conscience, and even though it violates the books technically, and they might even be from the perspective of, remember, think of a civilization where the Jewish court, I hate to use a comparison for obvious reasons, like Sharia law, because I don't like the comparison, but from a legal point of view, it's a comparison. You're talking about a body of law that regulates social life and religious life and civic life altogether. The lower court, so to speak, not the heavenly court, the lower court might make a decision that this person's a problematic person and they're violating our law, and we will punish them. But between God and the person, it might be very different. And even the Talmud, that's recognized that legality is one function, and it paints with a very broad brush, and it's necessary. You can't have, I live in New York still most of the time, although sometimes in Florida, but most of the time in New York. And, we hate alternate side of the streets parking, if anybody's ever had a treat, to experience that. But you can't very well expect them to say to you, oh, I'm sorry, Bubble, you're not feeling well today. You don't have to move your car. You got to move your car. And if you don't, you get a ticket. And that's how it goes. Maybe God says, I feel bad for you. You got a ticket. We'll try to make it up some way for you. But that's the point. There's the law, and it's different than let's say religious life and religious dictates. And so I think that's a mistake that sometimes religious people make, that they're assuming that the law, while it represents the will of the God, and there's a fascinating statement in Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. I think it's chapter 34, part 3, but I might not remember it right off the top of my head, but I think it's chapter 34, part 3, where he says exactly that. He says the law cannot cater to the individual, and even Torah law cannot always make each individual whole in terms of fairness. Of course, it's a logical statement, but to a religious person, it could be a polemical problem. Like, why? Well, God is perfect. How could God not even, make sure that even this one person is happy at this one moment in time in the thousands of years? But of course, Maimonides, who was much more rational about these things, he would say, what do you expect? You think that's how the law could work? So that's, I think, sometimes a mistake that more observant people do out of their tremendous deference, rightfully so, for these holy teachings. There's an assumption that it could escape its own parameters. It's still law, and law still operates under certain rules. I think what the secular people who are not as familiar with these texts, the mistake they might make is not revering it enough, because it's an extremely important document. And as I said, with incredible consistency, and incredible penetration. People don't even understand. I'm not saying they knew everything scientifically. Of course they didn't. It would be silly to say they did, but there was a lot of sophistication. I recently did a psychology of the Daf that talked about ancient surgery. They did plastic surgery, and the Greeks did it too. But the Talmud comments on it. There are certain instances where they were quite aware of how to manipulate skin growth and graft skin. And there was the Romans would surgically operate and remove the spleen of runners to help them run better. The Talmud discusses it because the Talmud has an entire section that deals with what's kosher and not kosher. And what makes even a kosher animal possibly not kosher is if its internal organs are damaged. So they have to decide whether the removal of a spleen it creates a terminal illness in the animal or could survive without its spleen. And the Roman runners would actually, they would run faster. I don't know why, if their spleen was removed. I don't even know if it's true medically, but they would surgically take out those spleens. So there's a lot of things that we don't appreciate about the ancient world. I'm not trying to say, I'm not one of those people, the aliens built built the pyramids and blah, blah, blah. But you'd be surprised at how much intelligence there was collected.
Absolutely. I think that's a valid point. I think, in my generation, right, sort of the millennials, we sometimes act as if history started like when we were born, 30, 35 years ago, not understanding that, people in civilization and Judaism and so forth has been around for a lot longer than some of us like to think. Before we get to the psychology aspect of the Daf, I'm curious to know, in terms of the Talmud, is this a document that you have to really start from the beginning, or can you dive in like a certain place and say, today I'm feeling X, so I want to learn more about X, or I'm in a certain place in my life, whether it's in a relationship or a certain journey in my Judaism, so I want to sort of not necessarily fast forward to a certain part of the Talmud, but maybe pay attention more to a certain part of it, and then maybe revisit maybe the beginning or parts of the beginning later. Is that something you can do, or does it have to be chronological?
No, you can jump in almost anywhere because it's not Western literature. Western literature works in a linear fashion. In fact, I'll tell people a secret. In basically any book around, all you really have to do is read the first chapter, maybe the second, the middle, and the last two. And if you're a bright person, you've got the book. And it's not because there aren't important things in the middle. I'm not saying that, but the way that Western literature is made there are thesis statements are stated at the beginning. There's a body, and then there's a summary. That's not the way the Talmud works. It predates Western literature. The idea of literature to begin with is very possible that certainly we know that the teachings of the Talmud existed orally for hundreds of years. We're talking about hundreds of years. We're not dealing with a literary society, even though the ancient Jews had a lot more writing than most because they had sacred scriptures that were required to be written. So that means they invested a great deal before books, before codexes in maintaining their writings and preserving them. But they also had writings that were forbidden to be written down and had to be retained in an oral quality. So orality is like storytelling. Which is not to say that it's mythological and inaccurate, but it operates very differently. There's a much more circular kind of recursive flowing pattern, like a song, or think of a ballad, how things repeat themselves, but differently. So there are discussions in the Talmud that last several pages and are extremely intricate. So obviously you can't start in the middle of that because it's built on there are many kinds of like Talmudic syllogisms that have to get built up one step of logic on top of another. However, it really is more associative. So even in it, there are different tractates, and each tractate has a title, but oftentimes the title is extremely loose within it. Once we're talking about what Rabbi Judah said when he happened to have been traveling from Palestine to Alexandria, he also taught three other things to his students. And it's very associative in that way, but also because it's oral. How do you remember things? You remember things because of your associations. The students remembered that they were on that boat with their rabbi going to Alexandria. And so then they remember the teachings. So Talmud is very associative in that way. And yes, you kind of can pick it up almost at any point and get into a discussion. and enjoy that. But I will say this, because it is very intricate, I will tell you what I call Feuerman's first postulate of Talmud, and that is that every page of the Talmud that you're reading assumes that you know every other page except for that one. So it means that you're entering into a discussion oftentimes that refers to very complicated ideas that you might have to look up and look at those discussions to even get what they're talking about. But you can. That's the point. There really isn't a beginning or an end in that way.
So if I'm somebody who isn't familiar with the Talmud, never learned it, never subscribed to any of your writings or your videos or others, could you recommend like a place to start that isn't necessarily the beginning, or is it sort of case by case? How would you recommend that?
Well, that's an interesting question. There are really 3 or 4 different kinds of discussions that occur in the Talmud. There's things having to do simply with religious ritual matters, which unlike some other religions in the Orthodox Jewish tradition, the rituals themselves are incredibly intricate and involve often hundreds of rules for how they're supposed to be performed. Like keeping kosher, for example, it's not as simple as just not eating pig and shrimp. The kind of knife that the animal has to be slaughtered with, and the ways in which the knife could be considered invalid, and the movement of the knife gets broken down into incredible detail, which might seem ridiculous to some, but once you get into the flow, you begin to realize something really special is going on, and it's hard to describe other than to experience it. But the point is, so there's legal Jewish ritual legal issues, then there's civic and social legal issues like regular tort laws, damages and compensations, wages, your property disputes. These discussions last hundreds of pages that deal with almost every aspect of title law, prior possession, what's considered proper evidence, what's considered good witnesses. Those discussions can be very intricate. And then there's more like ethical kinds of discussions where they actually talk about different kinds of ethics. What's considered better, a thought or an action? What's better to spend your time on? Giving charity and feeding the poor, or building bridges. Like these things actually become big discussions, and proofs from all over the scripture and from other precedents which elder rabbis had done in their lives become a part of this multi-layered, oftentimes multi-century discussion, because it's a dialogue that's going on between the characters that are being recorded. And some of the characters are hundreds of years apart, but because their students preserve their teaching so well, they get blended into a dialogue that emerges. It's kind of like, in a certain sense, and I don't think it's an accident because they came from very similar intellectual ground. You can see in Plato these imaginary dialogues with Socrates and his friends. They're imaginary to one extent, and they're also very true in another extent, right? Except this is not just imaginary friends. These are real characters with their teachings, but some of the dialogue becomes imaginary because they're separated by hundreds of years. So, and then there's also more what you'd call like mythological tales, which are a blend of what you might consider to be like embellishments or possibly traditions that exist external to the Bible, certain historical events, but sometimes they're merely metaphors, so they could be parables. There's a story in the Talmud about an argument that the sun and the moon had at the time of creation. Now, obviously, the sun and the moon, as far as we know, don't talk to each other, but the conversation that they had is of incredible significance, even in terms of modern leadership, and it's discussed in one of the tractates. This conversation that happened and God's reaction to the conversation. And it's really a theological tale of why the sun is brighter than the moon and what the role of the stars are. But that's not the point, in that sense. The point is you could see that it's varied. So if you take a random sampling of the Talmud, you might open up a page you find fascinating or not, depending on what you're interested in. But it's basically those areas: legal law, ethics, religious law, and then many, many different types of parables and stories, partially history of the Jewish people and partially just very interesting, enlightening stories.
Can you talk a little bit more about that parable or that story about the sun and the moon and the sort of metaphor of leadership? I'm particularly
Yeah.
interested in that.
So the according to the well, first of all, it's important to understand how Jewish exegesis works. It, like everything, there are rules that they operate on. It's not a bunch of people sat in a room and decided to tell stories at the campfire. There's a system. So it's important to understand that almost every type of rabbinic exegesis ultimately revolves around a problem with the text of the Bible. I don't mean like a problem that it's an unresolvable problem. I mean that there's some anomalous phrase, something that doesn't fit. Now, you can give much simpler answers. That's not the point. There are much simpler answers given by other Jewish commentaries, but the midrashic, the Agadic, that's what it's called. Agad in Hebrew means to tell over. The Agadic literature oftentimes involves taking what would be an extra turn of a phrase, some type of anomalous statement, and then from there using it as a springboard for either what, and it's a discussion amongst the commentaries themselves, what they represent. Is it an actual like bookmark for this tradition that is a real authentic tradition that this occurred, or is it just a bookmarker to begin this very interesting parable that has a deep truth to it that's true, even though it's not historically true, right? So, people can take their pick, because within even traditional Judaism, there are different camps, how literally they take the agadot, they're called, these different historical and mythological tales. So anyway, the sun, it says in you look in Genesis, I don't have all the verses in front of me, it's right there in the beginning, literally in the beginning, and one of the first few sentences. First, the sun and the moon are described as the two great lights, and then later it's described as the sun and the moon. Now, of course, textually, you could just say, well, two great lights. Obviously, the sun and the moon are the greatest lights in the sky. But the textual problem that the rabbis were noticing is, what do you mean two great lights? Clearly, the sun is the light. The moon, they're indicators in Zohar, and the origin of the Zohar itself is a discussion amongst rabbis, but they're indicators that the rabbis were aware that the sun didn't generate, that the moon didn't generate its own light. I can't tell you for sure. That's a scientific fact. It's not as clear, but they certainly understood just by observation that the sun was far more powerful than the moon. And also the Greeks and the Babylonians had fairly accurate ways of measuring distance. No, they were totally off, ultimately, because I guess the calculations can't work on a grand scale, but they basically used the Pythagorean theorem to calculate distance and such. And they knew the sun was much further away than the moon and things like that. They got that. So the sun is huge. The sun is huge, and the sun and the moon is not. So why does the Bible refer to them both as the great lights? They're not both great lights. And so that's where the story begins. And a teleological tale, it's called, in general, not just in Judaism. It means a story that has an end. Telos means an end in Greek. It means the point is to explain something. Right? I want to explain why there's a sun and a moon and stars instead of just two moons or two suns. So basically what happens is the moon says to God, it doesn't make sense that there should be two kings. Their two kings cannot each share a crown. Now we got to get the feeling ready what's going on over here, which is that the moon has in mind who should be the king, right? And he's not thinking about the sun. So God says, good point. I think I'll make you the smaller one. And then what happens is that God feels a little bad. Almost, there's so many nuances to these agadot, because it's fascinating. God kind of feels bad. It's almost like you can feel the archetype of a parent who sort of overreacts, and then you feel bad. So he gives the moon a consolation prize, and he says, "Look, don't worry. I'm going to give you the stars also. Like, you're going to have a lot of minions." So on the one hand, the moon kind of gets, as we'd say in Yiddish, his petch. He gets his punishment, and on the other hand, God kind of feels bad and mitigates it, and it goes further. that same story, as it continues, the rabbis note that on the festival of the new moon, which is every month in Judaism, a sacrifice is brought, a goat sin sacrifice is brought, and the question is, who sinned? Where's the sin? Normally, again, you'd have to read Leviticus to kind of get the feel for it, but a person who is aware of having committed a sin has to bring a sacrifice. There's different sacrifices prescribed, to achieve forgiveness for whatever sin. What sin did anybody do? It's a new month. And Talmud says it's God bringing a sacrifice, that he wants forgiveness for having shrunk the moon, which, it's hard to know exactly what it means, but it means something profound. Like here you have some story expressing the agency of God, kind of acknowledging that even from the very moments of creation, something doesn't quite work out. And we're living in an imperfect world where things wax and wane. And it's just so powerful. I think you could go on for hours to really try to understand what they might have been hinting at over there. But that's an example of such a beautiful Agada, and it says many things about leadership, how God responds and the ambivalent response that God has, the arrogance of the moon, the ultimate truth of the fact that you can't have it. Most companies that have two CEOs fail. The research shows it's great to have some type of collaboration, but ultimately you need a leader who takes responsibility and makes the final decision. And you can't have two leaders. So there are many discussions like that in the Talmud, but that's certainly one that comes to mind.
Fascinating and very relevant to today's day and age. So let's now talk about the psychology of the Daf. It's something that it seems to me from the outside looking in that you took sort of the two worlds that you subscribe to the most, which is clinical psychology and Judaism, and sort of combined them in a very creative and interesting way. Can you tell us more about that and how it came to life and what it looks like today?
Yes. So as I said, it kind of was an invisible bet with my father, where he did this intuitively. He accomplished many things in his life. He didn't have the time to do this comprehensively, but from time to time he would show me with a lot of ingenuity and insight, like something that he read psychologically or pedagogically, and then show a corresponding idea in the Talmud or in the Agada that made that work. So I wanted to see, like I said, with a lot of time on my hands in the beginning. Now I don't have any time on my hands. It's very, very hard to keep it up, but it's a worthwhile endeavor. It's going to take 7.5 years. I'm only about 2.5 years into this effort. And as George Burns used to say, I can't die because my calendar is booked for the next 10 years. So I'm just hoping that my goal is first to finish this all in English, and then to do the second round, the next cycle, to write it up in Hebrew. So I got about another 10 years that my calendar is booked. So I hope it'll work. I mean, George Burns lived to 100, so maybe I'll succeed there too. So the idea was just to see if it could be done. It's not something that I could have done 15 years ago. It takes a long time and a lot of time to study Talmud and develop some mastery. I do not have mastery of it by far, but having studied the Talmud more than once, through it completely, you begin to develop at least an instinct for certain ideas. I might not remember what page something is on, but I might remember a discussion that I think ties in. And so it takes a lot of work. It takes about between 20 and 25 hours a week to prepare 7 unique ideas for 7 pages, because I just never know where it's going to go. I have to go where my curiosity goes. And some pages of the Talmud are extremely dry and just dealing with a cow in a field. And really, what can you do? How much psychology can involve a cow in a field? But you'd be surprised. People could look up the blog and see. And sometimes it's very rich and it's easy. It takes only a few minutes, because like that particular page that deals with the sun and the moon, wow. I mean, you don't really need a lot of help to find the psychology in that. So it's become this labor of love, and it's very exciting. And sometimes I myself am pretty amazed and grateful to God that I'm able to just mine what I feel to be original, really sometimes very new content, even though we're dealing with something that Jews have studied for now more than 2,000 years and written about it extensively. There's so much commentary on the Talmud, but believe it or not, there's new stuff that you can find and very interesting things. Really, some things that surprised me. I just followed my curiosity, and I will put a plug in for Sefaria. Sefaria is an online Hebrew database which has thousands of Jewish books aside from the basic canonical texts that's searchable. And it's remarkable because, like I said, I might remember that there is a teaching, but I can't find it. And I like to always give my sources. I won't say anything without a source. If it's my opinion, I'll preface it with my opinion out of reverence for the text. But if I quote something, I have to say where it comes from. So that takes time too. But Safari is a wonderful tool. Those guys get a lot of credit. So I'm going to give them a plug.
So I looked up your psychology of the Daf on YouTube, and you have a lot of videos on there. You've written a lot on the internet as well. Again, somebody who's brand new to this, if there's maybe one psychology that you've done, one video that you've done on YouTube, which one would you recommend to start with?
That's really hard to say. I can tell you a couple of topics, but the thing is, because the Talmud just jumps around, ultimately, I do believe when I'm finished, if God gives me the strength and I'm able to finish the whole cycle, if this gets properly indexed, it really could become almost an encyclopedia of psychology and Judaism, because there's almost nothing that isn't covered. For instance, what's going to come up very soon on page 55 of Talmud Yevamot is actually the halachic status of gender reassignment surgery. And incredibly, there I get a discussion about plastic surgery, a commentary on the Bible. Rabbeinu Hananel, this man lived in, I believe, the 11th century. Okay, he makes a comment about what appears to be some kind of transgender plastic surgery. And you can read it for yourself. I've tried to analyze it, and there are other possibilities for what he means. And they write it in the Hebrew originally too, and then in the English, because when it's something like this, it's really subject to interpretation. I want those who are knowledgeable in Hebrew to see the original source material. But it does sound like that's what he's saying, and that's where I begin to look up and talk about other examples in Talmud where they did plastic surgery. So that's a very relevant issue, and we're going to hold discussion about that. I don't think that should be introduction. It should be our introduction to Talmud. I think it doesn't really actually shine light on some of the incredible depths of the Talmud. But what it does do is it certainly shows you how relevant it could be. Something to me that I discovered is it's not a major point, but again, it shows you something about the comprehensiveness of the text. And I'm very proud of it because I do believe it's an original discovery. There was a certain phrase that was used. This one sage said about another sage, he enlightened us. He brought light to our eyes. And it was an odd phrase. And like I said, I wish I had encyclopedic knowledge of the Talmud, but my instincts are enough that I said, I haven't heard that phrase that often. So thanks to Safari, I did a search. It turns up only 3 times in all 2,000 something pages of the Talmud. And in all 3 times, it involves only one particular sage, the same guy. And the fellow is blind. And it's so powerful because I'll talk in a minute about why they use that phrase in regard to him, because I think it also has multiple valences, why they use that phrase. But let's just talk about the precision. This is a document that's composed over hundreds of years. And they use a particular phrase 3 times. Each 3 times, it's only that sage, and he's blind. I mean, wow, right? We're talking about they didn't have computer processors, they didn't have electric lights. They're writing this stuff on parchment, passing it down, no printing press, passing it down from generation to generation, and that kind of accuracy and fidelity is preserved. It's simply remarkable. It's astounding. What I do think they were driving at was, aside from just being clever, I think, by the way, incidentally, in Talmudic idiom, the word for a blind man is a euphemism. It's called sagei nahar, much light. So in general, there's a certain politeness, almost like an Oriental kind of, politeness and respect. So you're not going to call somebody blind. You're going to call them the opposite, right? That they have a lot of light. So on one level, that's what they kind of were alluding to, that he enlightened us. But I think it's deeper. I think they even meant it like mystically and theurgically. They wanted him to channel the experience of vision because they knew that he couldn't see. He was handicapped. He had to rely on other people to see. And so they wanted him to have the experience of sight and have him feel like the wholeness and the competency. And they said, you enlightened us. You, the blind man who cannot see, saw the teaching more than we saw it. It's quite beautiful. What can I tell you? And as far as I know, nobody comments on this. It's my original observation. And it just came from this, I never heard that phrase before. But I have to say, if it wasn't for Safari, I wouldn't be able to do the search. Safari is very helpful. There are some great sages throughout Jewish history that had encyclopedic knowledge. There's something called the pin test, which is that if you would imagine if you took a Talmud, you lined up all the books and you stuck a pin through it, these rabbis had such a photographic memory that they can tell you every letter that the pin passes through. And this is not like stuff of legend. One of my friends from yeshiva, his father actually was able to pass the pin test. His son wasn't as bright as his father. His son, if you showed him the corner of the bottom of any page, he could tell you what page it was. He wasn't as bright as his father.
That's funny.
It's astounding what people are capable of. I'm not that smart. I'm creative and a plugger, and I plug away. But there are people that really know Talmud by heart, backwards and forwards, which is just astounding. So should I tell you more? There's no
I'm
end.
I'm just looking at, some of the more popular videos that you have on YouTube. I mean, one's called Wedding Night Trauma. Another one is called Premature Ejaculation. Another one is called The Mitzvah of Sexual Pleasure. I mean, it's really quite interesting. I'm curious to know, another one here, Emotional Connection versus Sex. Very provocative in a good way, of course, not necessarily in a bad way, but it seems to me from what you're saying and some of the things that you've talked about in your psychology of the Daf and the conversation that we're having now, is that the Jewish sages and the thinkers and the philosophers of those times, of the Talmudic times, for example, were quite provocative. And it seems to me that in the Western world, in the world we live in today, that sort of provocation and religion, which is what Judaism seems to be categorized as today, are sort of diametrically opposed. Whereas what I'm hearing from you is quite the opposite. Judaism is very provocative. It is very progressive. It is very intellectually stimulating and outside the box thinking. And as you said, creative. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that sometimes it's hard to find a balance between appropriate modesty, which really is something I think that many people today are lacking, and our world is in that way a lot less respectful of the privacy and the dignity of human sexuality. However, and the rabbis made a point often of being extremely modest in their behavior and in their ordinary speech. But here's where it's fascinating. Whenever they thought that some lack of clarity, some aspect of actual Torah wisdom would be sacrificed, they were incredibly, almost embarrassingly sexually explicit. I mean, there's pages of the Talmud that deal with the act of intromission, that deal with the exact moment when sexual intercourse begins and what that means. And again, there are ethical and legal considerations, what that's about, but there's also psychological implications that come by the wayside, which I'll maybe give an example of in a minute. But the point is that the rabbis, for instance, observed in the Torah, observes that when in the part where Noah is taking the animals onto the ark, instead of the Torah referring to the animals as there's a Hebrew word you don't have it in English, the Hebrew word for something that's not kosher. It's its own word. Instead, it refers to animals that are not kosher. So the Talmud says, you see, the Bible speaks in a roundabout way because it doesn't want to say something itself that's unclean. See, but in English, already unclean is already euphemistic because there isn't a word, in certain groups. Language itself is fascinating because what your language uses and doesn't use says something about the fundamental beliefs. So in English, there isn't a word for something that itself, maybe you'd say profane, but you see, profane just means the opposite of holy. It doesn't mean corrupted and like polluted. But in other languages, like in Hebrew, you have the word tameh, which means, like corrupted and polluted, or in the Bang of the Ivory Coast, Zozoa. There's different, like in certain languages. By the way, one of the things my father observed, since I mentioned him, I try to say some of his teachings. He was a master of many languages, including Greek and Latin and Yiddish and Hebrew. And he observed that Hebrew has no word for fail or fun or fair. Now, modern Israelis who don't necessarily understand biblical Hebrew, they'll say, what do you mean? There's kishalon and there's kef. But you see, that's the proof, because kef is an Arabic word. Whenever you take a word from a different language, it tells you that they don't have that word. There is no Hebrew word for fun. And kishalon, if you look in biblical Hebrew, to be nechshal means to stumble. And that's a world of difference. That's not fail. Stumble implies, as it says in Proverbs, the righteous person will stumble 7 times and then get up again. It's a totally different meaning. And of course, when Israelis have indignation, they say, "Is it lo fair? This is not fair," because they do not have a word. Fascinating. So a lot of that comes out in language. But the point is, I digress. The point is that the rabbis observed that even though the Torah goes out of its way, when there's a teaching that will lose precision, it will be in the most explicit and graphic language. And so every part of the human anatomy is discussed extensively. They were, again, very knowledgeable. They whether they developed this simultaneously or they did, we do know there was a tremendous amount of discussion recorded in the Talmud and the Mishnah between the Alexandrians and Alexandria in ancient Greece was truly an intellectual melting pot, and the mystical traditions of the Jews and of the Gnostics, and I don't. There's a lot of stuff going on. There was a lot of cross discussion, and it's even recorded in the Talmud. So I don't know who got who from what, but there's certainly, and there might have been parallel traditions that go back in the ancient world even further, to the nature of the soul and metaphysics. But the point is that they had a lot to say about a lot of things medically and otherwise. And yes, something like premature ejaculation, they didn't consider that a syndrome in that way, as today we diagnose everything. And in the ancient world, many things were experiences and ways of living that were not considered necessarily a diagnostic category. But nevertheless, many of those things are addressed, and they can be mined for wisdom and really good ideas, because they didn't shy away from it. They often can talk about things without a lot of sentimentality, and therefore really get to the heart of the matter. There's a famous Yiddish joke or kind of story, which I don't know it in Yiddish very well, but basically there was it's about a guilty conscience, and there was a ganav in town. A ganav in Yiddish means a robber, and nobody knew who the guy was. And they really, every couple of days, another valuable item was disappearing, and the rabbi of the town didn't know what to do. And finally, he when everybody's gathered in synagogue, so the whole town is there, he calls out, "The ganav's hat is on fire!" And all of a sudden, one guy goes like this. Oh! So it's actually a parable that has a lot of meaning. It's not just about a guilty conscience. It's kind of about how deep down, the Jewish soul is so pure that even the ganav, even the robber, knows he's a robber. So he's the only guy who puts his hand on his head. But anyway, a lot of the difficulty people have, religious people might have about talking about sexuality, might stem from the ganav's hat's on fire. If you feel incomplete, and understandably, many of us rightfully feel that way. We feel incomplete in our mastery of our sexual impulses, and when we feel guilty and conflicted, so it's difficult to have public discourse about it. Of course, there's the opposite. Maybe today people talk about every aspect of sexuality, but that doesn't mean that they feel complete. That's a reaction formation. They feel so incomplete that they're whistling past the graveyard, and they act as if there's nothing they should feel bad about, which is neither constructive. But the rabbis of the Talmud, who represented really the personalities in the Talmud, there's only maybe throughout these 400 or 500 years, 60 or 70 incredibly, gifted masters and teachers. And so many of these people really were quite literally paragons of virtue, and they didn't have a guilty conscience. And if they wanted, there's a story in the Talmud of this student that wanted to follow his master around and find out everything that he does, because they believed that you couldn't learn from a book. Again, we're dealing with a culture that's much more oral than we can possibly imagine. It's what you call, even though at that time there was a lot being written down, it's what Walter Ong would call a culture with oral residue, which means that primarily the culture still thinks orally. So they didn't think that you could learn from a book anything. The book might be a reminder, like your own notes on a class, but you didn't learn from your notes, you learned from the class. So anyway, the students would follow their masters around, for years, watching everything they do, how they recite blessings, how they walk, how they speak to their children, and make mental note of it. And it was like a kind of tradition, like someone might follow a karate master or whatever, or a guru. And anyway, one story, the rabbi is being intimate with his wife, and all of a sudden he hears an exclamation, and there's a student under the bed, and he says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, his name was Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana says, "Torah he, this is Torah. I need to learn this too." And he says, "Get out." But the point is, actually, notably, what the student was surprised about is the rabbi was engaging with great gusto and levity with his wife. It's, I think, on page 65 in Talmud Brachos, and he thought that was like immodest. But oftentimes the young, right, the young initiate to religion, takes things maybe too literally, more seriously than they need to. So this rabbi, who was more seasoned, he understood there's a time for everything. With his wife, he is going to enjoy the blessings of God and family, and be with his wife. And he was not very inhibited, apparently, from the story. But like these are just the fascinating tidbits from the Talmud. It's probably disrespectful to call them tidbits. Fascinating realia of the Talmud.
Wow. Simcha, this has been such an amazing episode. I've learned a lot from you, and I'm sure the listeners feel the same way. Thank you so much for doing this. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.